It was a crisp autumn morning when Ethan, an experienced forest ranger, found himself deep in the woods, following a well-worn trail. He had walked this path countless times over the years, but that day something felt different. The trees whispered with a slight breeze, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. It was a peaceful, solitary place, one Ethan had come to cherish during his years of service. But that day his usual quiet walk was interrupted by a sound. A faint, desperate cry echoed through the trees. At first he thought it was an injured animal or maybe a bird in distress, but as he listened closer it became clear. The cry was a cub's. A bear cub no less. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had heard the calls of bears in the wild before, but never like this, never with such a sense of urgency. He followed the sound carefully, moving through the dense underbrush until he came upon a small clearing. There, near the edge of a stream, was the cub. It was young, too young to be away from its mother. The cub was trembling, its tiny body covered in mud, its fur matted and dirty. Its wide, scared eyes locked onto Ethan as he crouched down, making himself appear less threatening. The sight of the cub's fear struck Ethan deeply. He knew all too well how dangerous it was for such a young animal to be alone. In the wild, without its mother's protection, it wouldn't survive long. The question was, what had happened to the cub's mother? Had something happened to her? Was the cub abandoned? The woods were no stranger to danger, and wild animals often found themselves caught in circumstances beyond their control. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He approached the cub slowly, speaking in a soft, calming voice. He could feel the tension in the air as the cub watched him warily. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan reached out, his hand gentle and steady. The cub's initial hesitation began to fade, and before long, it nuzzled its head against his palm as if seeking comfort. Ethan knew the decision he was about to make was not one to be taken lightly. Taking a wild animal out of its natural habitat was risky. He'd heard countless stories of humans trying to intervene with nature, only to make things worse. But in this moment he couldn't just leave the cub to fend for itself. The forest was no place for a lone cub this young. Carefully, Ethan scooped up the cub, cradling it against his chest. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He was about to change both of their lives forever. As he made his way back to his cabin, the cub, who had yet to be named, seemed to settle, its breathing steadying. Ethan could feel the warmth of its small body against his, and he could only imagine the fear it must have felt being alone in the wild. He made a promise right then and there, that he would do everything he could to give this little cub a chance to survive, to thrive, and to one day return to the wild. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming responsibility. Ethan set up a small pen for the cub outside his cabin, trying to replicate as much of the wild environment as he could. He knew it was essential to make the cub feel safe, but also to keep it separate enough that it wouldn't become too accustomed to human interaction. He named the cub Kodiak, after the strong, powerful bear species of the Alaskan wilderness. Kodiak, despite his small size, had an undeniable presence. He grew quickly, with each passing week showing more strength and curiosity. Ethan watched in awe as the cub began to explore, testing his boundaries. But even with the wildness growing within him, Kodiak remained attached to Ethan in a way that was hard to explain. The bond they shared was unmistakable, and over time, it became clear that this wasn't just about survival, it was about something deeper, something more profound. Ethan began researching bear behavior, reaching out to experts and even some wildlife rehabilitators for advice. The more he learned, the more he realized how complex Kodiak's situation was. If the cub were to ever return to the wild, it needed to be fully prepared. Kodiak's instincts had to be honed, and he had to be taught how to live independently in the forest. Ethan knew that he wasn't just playing the role of a caretaker. He was preparing Kodiak for a life he may never have known had he not intervened. But there was a complication Ethan hadn't foreseen. Kodiak was growing more attached to him, and as much as he wanted to keep the cub safe, he knew the day would come when Kodiak would need to leave him. The reality of letting go weighed heavily on Ethan's heart. He had come to care for the cub deeply, and the idea of releasing him back into the wild was both beautiful and heartbreaking. As the seasons changed, Kodiak flourished. His fur thickened with the winter months, and he grew taller and stronger, developing into a young bear who no longer needed the constant care he once had. Ethan knew that the time to let go was near. But as he watched Kodiak interact with the forest around him, his instincts telling him when to be cautious and when to roam freely, Ethan knew that Kodiak was ready. He was more than just a cub now, he was a bear, fully capable of surviving in the wild once more. The day of release arrived on a clear spring morning. Ethan took Kodiak to a remote area of the forest, far from any human activity. He walked beside him for a while, the familiar bond between them still strong, but something had shifted. Kodiak no longer needed him in the same way. As they reached the clearing where the wild stretched out before them, Ethan paused. He looked down at Kodiak, who stood a few feet away, his eyes scanning the landscape. There was no hesitation in his movements. Kodiak was ready. With one last look, Ethan knelt down, placing a hand on Kodiak's shoulder. "You're free now," he whispered. Kodiak turned, looked back at him for a brief moment, and then, without a sound, padded off into the forest. Ethan stood there, his heart heavy, but also filled with pride. He had done what he could. He had given Kodiak the tools to survive, the love to heal, and the strength to go back to where he belonged. The story of Ethan and Kodiak would never leave him. It had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. He had learned that sometimes saving a life wasn't just about rescuing, it was about knowing when to let go. And though Kodiak was no longer by his side, the impact of their journey together stayed with Ethan every day. What Ethan didn't know, though, was that Kodiak's story wasn't over. Over the years, Kodiak would grow into one of the most majestic and powerful bears in the region, and Ethan would hear tales of a great bear protecting the forest. A bear with striking features, unmistakable in his size and strength. Word would spread through the nearby towns of a bear who, many said, seemed to have an unusual bond with humans. And though Ethan never saw Kodiak again, he often found himself walking those same woods, wondering if Kodiak was out there, still carrying the lessons of his youth, still roaming free in the wild. Sometimes the most profound stories aren't about the rescue, it's about what happens next. For Ethan, that story would forever be one of love, loss, and the incredible beauty of nature's wildest creatures. And for Kodiak, it was a story of survival, resilience, and the deep connection between a man and a bear that would never be forgotten.